What is the most successful propaganda effort in history? Several years ago I had read about this and started mentioning this on Reddit and would get downvoted to oblivion for daring to say fat isn't to blame, it's sugar. I'm glad that just in the last few years this has been turning around. Edit. Also, I just remembered something else. There's that Seinfeld episode with that super good non-fat yogurt that everyone devours and everyone gains a ton of weight. In that episode, they do some sleuthing and it turns out it was a lie, that the yogurt did actually have fat. But what's ironic is that had the episode been tweaked, the yogurt could actually have been non-fat, but just loaded with sugar, and the results would have been the same. Diamonds can actually burn with enough oxygen and heat. They also degrade back to graphite on their own, over a billion years, but still, or much more rapidly if the proper energy source is used, say a high-energy laser. The real propaganda is that diamonds are very rare. They are not, just highly controlled by De Beers, who are known to buy any competing mines. Of all the precious stones, diamonds are the most common. This is definitely up there. Nobody wanted diamonds before and WR slowly convinced nearly every woman that their soul must spend at least 3 months' salary to prove his love. Most people's grandparents I know only wore gold wedding bands as a token of their vows. If there was a diamond ring, it came after as an anniversary gift. Edit. I'm not saying diamond, or other precious stone, engagement rings didn't exist back in the day. Only the extremely wealthy owned diamond rings. I'm saying De Beers just convinced most women that they needed one regardless of household income. Yes, this was a legit lawsuit, not frivolous at all. The coffee was way too hot. They had been warned about it many times and didn't fix it. MCD's policy was that coffee be served at a temp that could cause serious burns in seconds. 18190F. They had 700 plus other complaints and lawsuits prior to her and had paid out on many of them. MCDS offered to pay a whopping $800 to her to settle, so she went to court. I got burned by hot tea in Tivana when the lady didn't snap the lid on. I only got a first-degree burn since I didn't spill much of it, but it still hurt. I can't imagine how painful it would be to be sitting and having a whole cup of extra hot coffee spill. I did get a pretty bad burn on my tongue from some shit gas station coffee that was extremely hot. I took a tiny sip and spit it out, but my tongue was burned for 2 weeks. My dad took a sip of the same coffee 30 minutes later and burned his mouth too, but nowhere near as badly as I burned mine. That Jesse Owens embarrassed Hitler and his attempt to showcase Aryan superiority at the 1936. Even now, this is the story that so many people hear, but it's really nothing more than a lie to project any guilt by the Americans for how they treated Owens onto Hitler and the Nazis. In reality, Hitler wasn't particularly bothered by his 4 gold medals. He basically made a shrug and comment about black people having an unfair physical advantage and that they shouldn't be allowed to compete in future events. And Jesse Owens himself described Hitler acknowledging him warmly when they briefly encountered each other. The real reason Hitler left the stadium without shaking hands with him was because he never actually shook hands with any athletes. On this first day, he only shook hands with the German medal winners, but was told he had to shake hands with all of them, or none at all. He decided on none at all. Basically, he left early because he gave not one shit about the actual sport. To him, the Olympics were nothing more than work, and he was a man of leisure. Whether Owens won or not was irrelevant. The fact was that the Olympics were still giving legitimacy and international attention to Nazi Germany, and that was all he cared about. On the other hand, the way Jesse Owens was treated by his own country was appalling. He was never once invited to the White House, like the white athletes, and President Roosevelt didn't send him a telegram of congratulations. He was still subject to the same segregation laws that all black people had to suffer at the time. Even Nazi Germany didn't impose any on him. He once had to enter the Waldorf Astoria hotel through the service entrance in order to attend his own reception. To put it very simply, the story of Hitler snubbing Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics that is so well known. is in fact a clever propaganda story designed to project one of America's worst snubs of its own athlete onto Hitler. To add a similar misconception, the claim that Australian Peter Norman refused to support or even disagreed with Tommy Smith and John Carlos during their protest at the 1968 Olympics is pure bullshit. Norman was very sympathetic with their ideals, and vocally opposed Australia's earlier policy of White Australia. All three of them wore Olympic human rights badges in solidarity, and Norman was also the one who suggested that Carlos use Smith's left glove when he'd forgotten his own. When a statue was made of the event in San Jose, Norman insisted that he was not included, so that others could stand beside Smith and Carlos. Smith and Carlos were even pallbearers at Norman's funeral. He got a lot of shit for his support of the two, including not being allowed to compete in 1972, despite qualifying multiple times, and not even being invited to the celebrations in 2001. Sydney hosted the Olympics. The U.S., however, did invite him when they heard that. He didn't get a formal apology until 2012, 4 years after he died. What are you talking about? The war on drugs was a huge success. Small groups of rich white people have been struggling to find ways to purchase black slaves again since the end of the Civil War, and now, with the advent of the war on drugs, they've done even better. They've got the federal government paying them for taking the slaves. The government makes the unjust laws that the rich white people tell them to make, labeling a bunch of innocent people as criminals. The government rounds up these innocent people on our dime, policing only the areas that the rich white people tell them to police, typically black communities, uses our money to prosecute them, and then after conviction, uses more of our money to pay the rich white people to take the innocent person and use that person as a slave. Then the rich white person can pocket any profit earned by their new slave. This is an insanely efficient system, and I haven't even talked yet about the scheme for using the American education system to feed more people to the prisons for the rich white people to use as slaves. 2.1 million in prison, 500,000 not yet convicted of a crime, almost 1 million in for non-violent crimes. The land of the free. The personal sacrifice narrative with climate change is nothing but an excuse by corporations and government to justify declining standards of living. Almost beyond belief that there are actually people out there who say stuff like "I'm not going to have kids see of climate change and believe it." First of all, no amount of personal sacrifice in developed countries will offset emissions in China, India and elsewhere. Second, and most importantly, it would be incredibly easy to fix climate change if we actually wanted to. Bulk carbon sequestration directly from the air, the most expensive sequestration option, would cost about $100 a ton, even without future R&D to bring the cost down. Worldwide emissions of CO2 are about 36 billion tons a year, so $3.6 trillion a year to get to zero net emissions, without any personal sacrifice by common people, spread over every county on Earth. That's about what we spent on Iraq and Afghanistan. Fucking nothing in the scheme of things, and yet instead of just dealing with things head-on we have to turn climate change into some huge moral issue that requires sacrifice. Recycling plastics. Something like only 9 to 10% of recycled plastic is actually recycled. Plastics that we all recycle are sent to a recycling center where they are melted, smashed into big cubes. Plastic-using companies, say Coca-Cola, have to then buy these cubes to use for their bottling. It typically is more labor-intensive and expensive to use these recycled cubes than to just use new plastic. Therefore, after some time, these cubes are discarded by recycling companies just like normal trash is. Big Oil pushed recycling propaganda hard to make people feel better about using plastics when they switched over from glass. I used to work in the warehouse of a national park, and one of my duties was to empty and sort through the recycling trailers across the property. It was tough and often disgusting work, but I was at least able to take pride in doing something good for the environment, or so I thought. It turns out that the majority of this stuff I cleared out, truckloads of cardboard, plastic, aluminum cans, and glass bottles, was sent straight to a nearby landfill. The primary purpose of our recycling program was to give off the appearance of being environmentally conscious to our guests, but in reality, it was just a huge waste of time. Luckily, that job was only seasonal. Pretty much anything about Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. All historical evidence shows Anne as a sweet, kind, generous woman who genuinely loved Henry. They were together for around a decade, whilst all contemporary accounts show Jane to be nasty, conniving and abusive to her maids. Anne's reputation was initially smeared because Henry's advisors disliked how much money that they wanted spent on them, their projects, she gave to charity. They started a mass smear campaign, and executed her based on trumped-up charges that most historians agree were utterly false. The propaganda continued after her execution to ensure that Henry didn't look bad. Jane Seymour only has a positive reputation because she was paraded around as a sort of angelic type, in large part to justify Henry's relationship with her to the public, who, contrary to popular fiction, were fond of Anne due to her charity and advocacy work, so as to prevent unrest. This reputation continued after her death and was intentionally emphasized to further legitimize Edward's claim over Mary and Elizabeth's. Let's not forget Catherine Howard. She was forced to marry Henry at the age of 16-17. He was in his 50s. She'd been abused a lot by trusted men. She then got abused again and called to be a traitor and decapitated before she turned 20. And Henry's reaction to her sleeping with another man was so angry it showed how much he clearly lied about Anne. She was an abused child, forced to marry an older man and then murdered. So of course she's portrayed as a sexual deviant corrupting man, even in 6. I'd have to say the war in Iraq. They had nothing to do with 9/11 and had no weapons of mass destruction. Yet the Bush administration was able to convince the country to support the invasion through manipulating the media. 15-20 years later, $1 trillion spent, thousands of lives lost, countless injured, and the region is completely destabilized, all to line the pockets of defense contractors with cost-plus no-bid contracts. This times $1 billion, to sucker an entire nation of people into getting work-life balance wrong for the betterment of a nation's GDP is masterful propaganda. And when most of those people reach that moment in their life when they realize it won't happen for them, it's not in any way, shape or form the government's fault or capitalism's fault. It's 100% their personal fault. Brilliant. I'm all for a modified American dream. There's a reason we are leaders in many areas, because we do celebrate and encourage entrepreneurs and invention and all that. Which is fantastic. We want to keep that up, but we do it in the most pointlessly brutal fashion, leading people without health care, without family leave, without leave generally, etc. Well, it's not only about Thermopylae. They were known for breeding soldiers. Young boys started military training at 7, sent to fields away from home to train. A known motto that mothers would say to their sons is "Tanachipitaz," which roughly translates to "with it," or "on it," referring to their shield. And it means you better come back with the army or die in battle, as there isn't a bigger disgrace than being a deserter. Regardless of Thermopylae, this was a deeply militarized community, so I think it merits that reputation. Edit to add, they also were the first military to come up with those organized fighting formations using their shield and spears. This is what I wanted to post. The Red Scare poisoned the well for generations. Only recently has crazy socialist ideas such as Medicare for all started floating back up into the public consciousness. On top of that, the Red Scare allowed a massive increase in the government's ability to fuck with its populace. Anyone harboring even slightly radical ideas such as civil rights or being against Vietnam, investigate them for being a secret communist, then drag their name through the muck and discredit them. Worse still, there seems to be another Red Scare on the horizon. One of the best sellers at Barnes & Noble is a book titled American Marxists by Mark Levin. It's pretty much just blatant fear-mongering. According to Levin, everyone left of center are either Marxists. He uses communist, socialist, social democrats, and other groups as interchangeable buzzwords, or are secretly controlled by them. And, despite his book being objectively poorly written, it's like 50% quotes, 25% agreeing with quotes, 20% fear-mongering the secret Marxists, and only 5% actual analysis. It gets consistent 5-star reviews. In actuality, there isn't really a party for anyone left of progressives. The core of the Democratic Party is pretty much made up of people who economically have much more in common with the Republicans than they have with even Democratic socialists. It's only in very rare cases where anyone progressive gets into politics. The United States as a Christian nation. The early days of the U.S. saw a definite effort to avoid aligning with any specific religions, and freedom of worship was cited as a reason for originally leaving Europe. The nation's first president avoided all mention of God or Christ. The Pledges of Allegiance didn't have the words "under God" until 1954. So I would say anyone who thinks the U.S. is a Christian nation thinks so thanks to the propaganda effort in the 20th century to paint it as so. America beat the Nazis. It's been in our newspapers, books and TV shows since the war, but the Soviet Union suffered the most casualties among the Allies, dealt Germany the most casualties by far, and won the majority of the battles versus the Nazis, including the biggest tank battle in history. The propaganda was so successful a lot of Americans get angry even bringing it up despite it being historical fact. The Soviets are the main reason Hitler was defeated. Historical revisionism in the South post-Reconstruction. United Daughters of the Confederacy completely changed the historical narrative of the Civil War. They erected statues in the honor of Confederate heroes, pressured textbook authors to sanitize the violence of slavery, and portrayed Confederates as fighting for a noble cause. You can thank the UDC for the statistic that over half of Americans believe the Civil War was about states' rights. Probably the one that the U.S. right is still pumping out. Communism and socialism are both the epitome of evil, and everything that the right doesn't like, or that might help people without fucking them over, is somehow both communism and socialism at the same time. It's why so many Americans are rabidly against government-funded healthcare and loudly scream about how amazing the private system is, while also praying that they never need to actually use it because they might go bankrupt if it's something even moderately bad. https://www.adminline.com/word/advertise. Early 15c. Advertising, to take notice of, a sense now obsolete, from Old French advertis, present participle stem of adverter, earlier averter, make aware, call attention, remark, turn to, 12c, from Latin advertere to direct one's attention to, give heed, literally to turn toward, from ad to, toward, see ad, plus vertere to turn, see versus. The transitive sense of give notice to others, inform, warn, make clear or manifest, mid-15c, is by influence of advertisement. The specific commercial meaning call attention to goods for sale, rewards, etc. emerged by late 18c. Compare advert, v, turn, someone's, attention to, related, advertised, advertising. The word literally fucking means turning people's heads and getting their attention, and the idea that its sole purpose is manipulation came up in every single sociology class, business class, and comm class I took in college on my way to my degree. And I for damn sure know you don't speak for the professors of the highest rated sociology department in the country. And whether or not a presumptuous little Reddit twerp thinks they're worth their salt means jack fucking shit. So sit the hell down. Well, they do make basic errors, such as accusing governors of pardoning their own kin for drug offenses, while not pardoning anyone else at all. And the time they said a guy lived through 2 plane crashes, when he didn't fly on either of them. Then we have the one about police shooting a guy who had just dropped a toy gun, when actual video evidence showed he was still threatening police with it when they shot him. We also have them inventing bridges, for some reason. Let's not mention them being caught out palming fake celebrity social media accounts as being actual celebrity accounts. They attribute songs to albums they don't appear on. We'll also ignore them mixing up compression and friction in a story on space exploration. 2 completely different forces. How about the Facebook vote button conspiracy theory? This came up in a thread about Latin American culture. Some dude was hypothesizing that calcium-phosphorus balance was what determined height. Because Latin American countries drink so much soda, they have high phosphorus. Because Nordic countries drink so much milk, they have high calcium, and that is why their heights are different. The reason it made sense to me is I have seen talk about calcium-phosphorus balance a lot in talk about bone health. Basically people say you don't want too much of either, and stuff like calcium-fortified toothpaste or drinks can cause overcalcification if you don't have enough phosphorus. It's been a while and I'm absolutely not knowledgeable about the subject.